It's always important to be controlling costs when you're a CTO, and infrastructure is always a significant component of the P&L. And if you can make sure that people are focused on the environmental impact, it will have a cost in. And so you can advocate for GreenOps because it is tied to the bottom line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Green.io, the podcast for responsible technologists building a greener digital world, one bite at a time. Every 2 Tuesdays, our guests from across the globe share insights, tools, and alternative approaches, enabling people within the tech sector and beyond to boost digital sustainability. Migrating to a new cloud provider because of the lack of sustainability commitment from the previous one is almost never seen in our IT industry. So I was really impressed with the talk delivered by 2 back-market senior engineers at Green.io Paris last year. So impressed that I wanted to learn more about back-market engineering culture. I discovered teams who have seriously embraced the GreenOps approach and whose feedback could greatly benefit product and tech teams no matter the industry they work in. This is why I'm so excited to welcome Dawn Baker, back-market CTO, on the show today. Dawn is a senior engineering leader who has managed infrastructure, operations, and software development teams in organizations ranging from 50 to more than 100,000 employees, from startups to Fortune 500 companies. And a functional expertise spans across many layers of the technology stack, including data center, network, systems, and database operations, software engineering, of course, you name it. I guess you understood that she is a very versatile expert. Welcome to the show, Dawn, and thanks for making room in your busy calendar for this interview.
Thank you for inviting me, Gail. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is mine. I'd like to start asking you, what is the achievement from your teams which you are the proudest in terms of sustainability?
So it is definitely the migration of our infrastructure to a new cloud provider. We did it in under 6 months, and we have up to 40,000 containers in our infrastructure. So it's a significant achievement, and it's been a great results for us so far.
Yeah, what was the result that you were looking for starting such a massive project? Just before you answer this question, for the sake of understanding, what size of the tech stack and the human power are we talking about at back market? How many engineers?
Yes, so we have about 260 engineers at back market. We operate up to 40,000 containers, and we have about 4 million unique visitors a day to our site. We work really hard as a company to be conscious about our impact on the environment. And so when we were evaluating our next steps for our infrastructure, we were at a point where we needed to modernize our infrastructure. We're a 10-year-old company, and as happens in 10-year-old companies, we had a bit of debt that we needed to pay down, and it was going to require us to recast our infrastructure. And to do that, it gives you the opportunity, which doesn't come along very often, to do a change in cloud providers.
That was also an opportunistic move because it's not like you were scaling up the tech stack and suddenly a morning you say, okay, enough is enough. I want to change my cloud provider. It was also connected with a reflection on the current state of your tech stack and the level of technical depth you have reached. And okay, enough is enough. We need to refactor a bit, or maybe even replatform. And that's a great timing to ask ourselves on which platforms do we want to be hosted. Am I correct to state it that way?
Exactly.
And what were the results that you wanted to achieve in terms of sustainability by migrating from, I guess we can name them. It was made public in Green.io Paris that you migrated from AWS to a Google Cloud platform.
Yes, so the biggest factor in the decision in the end was the environmental impact and our ability to track it. number one, the visibility we get from Google Cloud on our CO2 emissions and the ability to choose locations with renewable power was a big factor in our decision. We're a B Corp, and this becomes a very important aspect of what we do, is to be able to report on that. So that became an important component of the decision-making process. And it's also that we can start to break down and start to invest in breaking down not only that information for the infrastructure, but each component of what we run, and be able to align teams around the impact that they have. We're still at the early stages of this because we just finished our migration in April, but we have ambitions to create greater and greater insights with more and more detail so that we can have a clear view of what it costs to serve our users, specifically for certain functionality, and be able to make decisions about an engineering investment on ways to improve that over.
So it means that the ultimate goal is that each team, feature team, I don't impact teams, I don't know how you name them, are accountable of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions they emit.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was the number one reason for you to migrating to Google Cloud, because they can provide this level of accuracy.
It was the biggest weight in the decision. There are, of course, other factors. There's a bit better visibility and higher impact we have on the roadmap and discussions that we can have with our account team. The level of partnership that's provided were also big factors. We run on Kubernetes, so having the managed GKE offering a definite uplift for us.
You mentioned Kubernetes. There are several projects around incorporating sustainability natively in K8 and also putting them in the CI/CD. Is it the sort of project that you're looking for?
Well, first we want to be able to have the level of granularity, which doesn't really exist today, on knowing for what type of instance that we choose, what can be the carbon footprint for that. And we did this. One of the engineers on my team, Florian Filet, he wrote an open source contribution that would, for AWS, using the data set provided by TEEDS. They did some research in 2021. So he wrote an open source tool called Track Carbon, and that allowed anyone to track the energy consumption and calculate carbon emissions for their use in AWS. That research, of course, was a point in time, and it didn't continue to evolve. And so we didn't have the data for the evolving instance. So it became obsolete. But we would love to be able to do that at this level of detail, not only for ourselves, but make it available to others as well, so that we could track with greater accuracy the impact at the instance level.
And on Google Cloud, because maybe I missed some recent updates, but I remember that Google shares some sustainability metrics for the different instances that are running, but the feedback I had so far is that it's not that much actionable for engineering teams, mostly because of the lag that it is updated on a monthly basis. Once again, if I remember that well, and that most of the time a software engineering team, they want to experiment things and see the next day or within the next few days if the change they made in the architecture, in the code, whatever the design has provided impact. So maybe could you clarify a bit how teams are actually using this information from Google Cloud to reduce their carbon footprint?
So today, we're not actually using it to reduce our carbon footprint. We're using it to create visibility. And visibility is the first step for accountability. If people are aware of the impact that they're having, they're more likely to take action on their own. And you're right, the data doesn't come in fast enough, right? Which is part of why we are looking at what different tooling we could have for ourselves to be able to take it a step further than gets provided from Google today. One of the things that we envision doing over time is having cost to serve through infrastructure costs, but also through carbon impact, because how well optimized your code is uses more or less CPU and uses more or less energy. And it correlates, of course, to how much spend you have, but not only. And so being able to have that picture, I think, is really important. It's also, I think every organization at some point starts to scrutinize the amount that they're spending on infrastructure, because you get to a size and scale, things are going well, that it starts to become a significant part of your P&L. And every team then ends up having to put focus on cost cutting and optimization. It's never fun, right? It's never a super motivating task for people. But when you think about the other way you can look at this, that is a different cost-cutting measure, far more motivating and highly correlated, is thinking about how can you reduce your carbon emissions? How can you reduce your impact on the planet? And it's a very different way to think about how to optimize your code, how to optimize your infrastructure to have an impact on, yes, the bottom line from a cost perspective, but it also has a big impact on the cost on the planet.
And so is it something that, I mean, do you have FinOps team today at Back Markets?
I would say we don't have a specific team. We have a focus area on FinOps.
Which means that each team has at least one person who's in charge of paying attention to the FinOps detail.
Right now, this is concentrated in our platform teams, looking at this to create the visibility across the feature teams.
And is it the same people within the platform team who will have the same focus on carbon accounting and creating visibility on carbon, or will there be different profiles?
It's the same people for us today. Again, we're at the beginning of this journey, and there are not a lot of models out there to follow.
I got it. And actually, going back to what you said previously about the tooling and the fact that you're still in search of the tooling, what are the tools that you've considered using, whether they're open source or paid tools, or are you actually considering building your own?
Well, one of the reasons we are looking at building our own tooling around this is because to do what we want, which is reproduce some of the work that was done by Florian on that open source project, is that it doesn't exist today. There's not a tool that will do that for us. There are some tools, I think, that show up that can give you some help, but they're still very high level and a bit generic and maybe not as actionable as they could be with a little more detail. And so of trying to find a path forward that would allow us to give real insights to our engineers to be able to make everyday decisions that can have an impact on how they do their work to optimize for carbon emissions.
That's really interesting because there are several tools popping up here and there. There are obvious open source tools such as Cloud Carbon Footprint or Cloud Scanner from Boa Vista. There are also several paid solutions, and most of the time they take the financial inputs from cloud provider, they cross it with emission factor or information from providers such as electricity maps, for instance, to get the carbon intensity of the electricity grid at a certain time in a certain day. And I was wondering, what other features do you find missing, especially you mentioned the granularity, that you want to develop your own tool?
All of those things you said are true, and there is definitely We have the ability to look at what type of power in which data center, what percentage is renewable, when can you run your intense job so that it's not competing at the time where there's heavy load on the grid. So all of that is true. And there are things certainly today that we could even do better with the tools that exist, like making sure that we are able to scale to zero at times when everything's idle, right? And to do that in an automated way. There's I think more work to do there, and again, very tied to cost as well in those cases. But when it comes to and I think this is the question that everyone has about their daily lives, is like, what can I do? Like, I'm just one person out of 7 or 8 billion on the planet. What does it matter what I do? And when we think about this, there's so much that we don't pay attention to, such as, and I'm going to put this in terms of the everyday human experience, where people don't think about it. And then let's talk about how that translates into engineering. So if you think about how many email addresses do you have, and how much storage are you using, and how many photos do you have that are uploaded into the cloud? When was the last time you looked at all of them, right? And every byte that is out there, your digital footprint, it also has a carbon cost because it's costing for that. And so when we think about that from an engineering perspective, what are the things that you store and never access? How much logging are you doing? And do you need to do that much logging? How long are you storing it for? And do you need to store it that long? And having some visibility into that is your daily dashboard, would be hugely, hugely helpful to hold yourself accountable for, are you putting your effort and the costs that you're doing in the right way?
Oh, well, that means that you're incorporating in this GreenOps dashboarding that you're building at Back Market also some a data management approach. Like you want also focus on storage, not only the amount of time that you're doing computing or using the servers at certain time of the day in certain location, but also incorporating this data management principles, like we store too much, we log too much, etc., etc. Am I right?
It's part of my vision for it, and I would say maybe a little too optimistic to say that we're in the process of building that functionality right now. But when you think about how people as individuals can have the impact, you have to go to that level of detail because that's where it starts. Everything starts from just a small amount of impact that compounds over time. And suddenly it's huge.
And that you can scale this impact. And what other features do you envision for this environmental dashboard and tooling that you want your teams to be able to build now that you've migrated to Google? So obviously we mentioned carbon aware, and it was also a bit of grid aware. We've just mentioned data management. Is there other aspect where you want to empower your engineering team to make better decisions?
That's a big question. I think from the perspective of software engineering, it goes beyond the work that we do from writing and executing code and hosting it in production, because that is also really important. The run part of software development is where probably the highest carbon costs are, because it's going all the time. And it is the most obvious place to look. And it's not only that, right? Because we're also doing monitoring. We also have a bunch of other tool sets we run to do our job. And all of those things combined is just one on top of another that is consuming, I think would be an advanced step here. Because the first most obvious place to look is absolutely on the run, on what you're doing runs every day and what that impact is. And it's the biggest chunk. At least we think that right now. I don't know if it would turn out to be true if you add up all the costs of day-to-day operations that aren't really about what's running. It's probably not as insignificant as we think, or we don't think about it. So I don't know, but it's an interesting place. I think that we should start to look and validate where do we have impact and where along the way can we optimize it. Because I find that when you start to think about this, you start to make different choices.
Could you give us an example of one of these choices that you've made differently thanks to sustainability inputs?
Okay, so we are reconsidering our business continuity disaster recovery planning and a non-zero cost to having a solid plan in place, right? And being able to make sure that we have the best possible RPO and RTO for the most reasonable impact, right? Because you can go hold backup, you can do warm backup, and you can do full, redundancy. Full redundancy obviously has the largest impact. It also costs the most, but it gives you the greatest peace of mind. You end up with so much just sitting and unused. Completely cold is a bit too long for recovery time at scale, right? So it can be a pretty long time. But especially in a cloud environment, having a warm, small footprint that you're able to manage closely can be a really nice compromise between the two and gives you the flexibility with a much lower impact.
Got it. And that's interesting to see that the carbon price has become part of the equation as much as the financial price of the recovery plans. And that leads me to another question, which is, how do you make GreenOps efficient and part of the discussion on almost every aspect of your engineering culture? Because we took the example of the cloud migration, of the example you just provided about the recovery plans. But I got it that you don't have yet all the tools that you want to provide the most accurate insights possible. But when I've discussed with your engineers, they were already very, very focused on GreenOps. So I was wondering, how did you achieve this focus on GreenOps across your teams?
So we're at a slight advantage maybe in this area because we are a mission-driven company with an environmental mission. And one of our corporate values is that it's not green enough, right? So this is a mantra that shows up everywhere in the culture. And having that kind of mindset, it's not only about your job, it really is about your life. And the mission and the values that that market holds attracts people who are aligned with them. And it becomes a part of everybody's thought process.
That raises a very interesting point, because do you believe that achieving such a GreenOps culture and focus would have been possible in, I would say, a regular Fortune 500 company? Or does it require first that the environmental culture is high enough? And, my question is for all the other CTO and CPO and head of engineering listening to you, do you have a chance to actually move the needle in the right direction to embrace GreenOps if you work in a more business as usual, I would say, company?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When I first started talking about carbon P&L with my peers, I met Patrick at an event for Google Cloud, and I was talking with him about carbon P&L because we at Back Market have started on the journey of a carbon P&L, and his company does it already, and they're a very big company, and they have a very active focus on this. And so it's possible. And I think that that is very inspiring that that's the case. I've seen the power of the employee base in this way as well. I spent some time at Google. The employees at Google are very environmentally oriented, and they do make noise about this. And Google as a company does respond to the things that their employees value in this way. It's harder, I think, in companies that are perhaps not as successful as that to get it to be a focus. There was a lot of discussion during the time I was at Fitbit from the employee base about making the devices more recyclable, having a better sustainability mindset around it, which was difficult to make a focus when the company isn't hugely profitable or hugely growing. When you're facing business headwinds, it is the first thing to fall to the back. That is a hard condition to fight against.
That's interesting because the way I framed the question was the wrong one. I expected that the mission of the company would influence how much a CTO has some leeway to implement GreenOps practices. And actually, your answer points toward a slightly different directions, which is it's not really the mission in itself, but it's more the power of employee engagement and the financial situation of the company, which might be, even for a B Corp, highly environmentally focused company facing a lot of turmoil business-wise, we might actually experience a reduction in the ambitions to achieve some environmental goals. Very interesting point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, so on the question you were actually asking, I do believe that a CTO in any company can push GreenOps because, especially today, the current younger generation of workers is far more aware of environmental impact than anyone was 20 years ago. And as I said earlier, it's always important to be controlling costs when you're a CTO, and because infrastructure is always a significant component of the P&L. And if you can make sure that people are focused on the environmental impact, it will have a cost impact. And so you can advocate for GreenOps because it is tied to the bottom line. And I do believe that the business will buy into it because the correlation is there.
Which is a great enabler. And you were discussing about advocating, and that's another question I was wondering. How much you manage to have a discussion with your CPO or CMO? I don't know how you're structured regarding product and marketing, but basically people pushing for some features when it comes to GreenOps. Like, do you manage to say, hey, well, maybe we shall not use video, or maybe this feature is not that useful? How much they are involved in this GreenOps process? Because we know that design set the tone for most of the music when it comes to GreenOps. So CTO, if they're asked to provide more and more features or more and more products, that can completely offset all their efforts to reduce their environmental footprint. So how is the level of the discussion at back market?
Again, because we have the it's not green enough value, it is a topic that comes up. I think we can do better than we're doing. And the engineering team has a greater responsibility and a bigger role to play in this than any other department because we have the information. We either have access to the information or we can get access to that information in a way that is a bit more difficult, perhaps, for the CMO and the CPO. If engineering teams are very conscientious about it, and if we provide the carbon impact as part of the planning, it can have a different impact and change people's minds. We are also the ones that are best positioned to propose alternatives and say, you are asking for this for an objective we understand as this, and we can achieve that same objective with a lower impact. It is one of the superpowers of engineering that we forget that we have, which is to have this level of influence over the entire corporation. Because we have the information, we have access to it, or we can get it. And with a little bit of effort, we can educate people and really influence the decisions that are made.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to close the episode, because you've already shared in full transparency and humility, I must say, it's not all shiny and perfect at Back Market, but it's really this focus and this first steps that you've already started and this culture that you managed to create. But we've briefly mentioned Back Market as being environmentally focused because of its very nature. How the discussion regarding e-waste, and maybe you can explain a bit what Back Market is doing to the audience, how this focus on e-waste, which is at the very core of Back Market mission, influences also the discussion within the engineering teams when it comes to GreenOps. And more specifically, I was wondering how much weight do you put on creating software that will not accelerate hardware obsolescence?
For me, that's a super interesting question. We have a fight against the ways of working for the OEMs, which is to make their devices obsolete. If they stop updating them, you can no longer get the latest OS update, the security updates, etc., beyond a certain model. And thanks to government regulations, these things are being extended more and more. And you see commitments from companies to provide longer term support for the devices that they make than they were 10 years ago. It's a good trend. So from an influence perspective, this is a focus at Back Market, is to make sure that we're active in this discussion and advocating for every person out there who wants to keep what they have and they just want it to work longer because they're happy with what they have. And through software development, that is what we do and what we advocate for and what we educate people about. Again, something interesting that I think we don't talk about very much is that we are, as engineers, probably almost worse than the general population when it comes to pushing for the latest technology on things. And I don't know how to change this, actually, because when you think about every time a new cloud provider or our cloud provider puts out their newest version of instances, they're faster and they're more efficient. And you have a dilemma in that you want to get the speed gains and the efficiency gains you can get from the latest hardware refresh. But the very nature of that hardware refresh creates e-waste. And so we have opposing forces. And the best that we can do to serve our business, because you have to stay competitive and responsive to fulfill the mission of getting people to buy through the circular economy. And this is where the carbon P&L comes in as well, to make sure that you're holding yourself accountable for what you put out, what you emit, and what you try to save, what you can save. But can you choose providers or hardware if you're doing on-prem that is upgradable in place? So maybe you don't have to replace entire chassis every time you're doing an upgrade. Can you choose a cloud provider that has documented and certified recycling practices? Because we haven't found a way today to get out of this cycle of the constant upgrades for faster, better compute power.
So if I understood you right, and that's a very open and transparent way that you put the issue on the table, it's the day-to-day dilemma of running GreenOps based on carbon P&L. I think it could wrap up the entire episode. Thank you joining and sharing that openly. And it was a pleasure to listening to your team also on GreenIO Paris stage. So thanks for all the support.
Thank you, Gail. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for listening to this GreenIO episode. If you enjoyed it, please take 30 seconds to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast or Spotify. I know it's not easy to find the feature on these apps, but I trust you to succeed. Sharing this episode on social media or directly with relatives working in a digital tech company seems also a good idea to provide them with inspiration. You got the point. Being an independent media, we rely mostly on you to get more responsible technologists like you on board. In our next episode, we will talk about agility and sustainability with Joanna Masraf, who founded Agilist for the Planet and the We Hope magazine, and Joanne Stone, a co-founder of GreenPO, to make sure that agile team setup will no longer be an excuse not to include sustainability requirements. One last thing. GreenIO is a podcast and much more. So visit greenio.tech to subscribe to our free monthly newsletter, read the latest article on our blog, and check the conferences we organize across the globe. We opened the call for speakers for our 5 planned conferences this year in Singapore, New York, Munich, London, and Paris. So if you want to share your experience in green software, sustainable design, GreenOps, responsible AI, you name it, please fill in the form. I'm looking forward to meeting you there to build with you, fellow responsible technologists, a greener digital world.
One bite